More than 30 mobile vehicles have been destroyed. Multiple assault waves have stopped before reaching the trenches. And around Pokrovsk, Russian infantry and tanks are now disappearing on the approach, not at the front line. This is not a battle in the old traditional way, but a pattern of short, fast, repeated clashes that happen day after day, where Ukrainian UAVs and FPV drones control every strip of forest, road, and open field around the city. Russian forces are trying to reach Pokrovsk, using mixed formations of infantry, light vehicles, and tanks moving in support, hoping this combination can open a new breakthrough axis in Donetsk. The plan looks flexible on paper, but the reality on the ground is far harsher because these columns are often detected early, tracked from a distance, and hit while still moving, before any assault formation can fully take shape. Instead of close combat, many of these attacks collapse during the approach phase, as drones spot movement, pass coordinates, and trigger strikes that break momentum in minutes. What is unfolding near Pokrovsk points to a deeper shift in how modern battles are decided, where movement itself becomes the most dangerous moment, not the clash at the trench. The central question is no longer about manpower or armor counts, but whether any force can still approach a contested city when the air above it turns every step forward into a visible and vulnerable target. Russian forces around Pokrovsk have clearly changed how they try to push forward, because large armored thrusts have given way to smaller and more flexible assault packages built around mobile infantry. Instead of long columns of tanks and armored vehicles, the advance now relies on soldiers moving with motorcycles, quad bikes, and light trucks, while tanks and armored vehicles stay behind to provide fire support rather than lead the movement. This structure is meant to keep the force moving fast and reduce exposure time, while still keeping heavy weapons close enough to respond when resistance appears. In mind, this setup looks adaptive and modern, but on the ground it creates new problems that become visible very quickly. The main goal of this approach is to shorten the window in which Russian units can be detected, because speed and dispersion are seen as the best defense against precision strikes. Infantry moves through forests, narrow paths, and open terrain that appears empty at first glance, aiming to slip between known Ukrainian firing zones. Light vehicles allow quick changes in direction and help units avoid obvious roads that have already been mapped as danger areas. Tanks and armored vehicles are held back to avoid early detection, with the idea that they will move forward only once infantry has found a path or fixed Ukrainian positions. This logic reflects a strong focus on movement control rather than direct confrontation. Around Pokrovsk, this method has been used again and again over many days, which shows that it is not an isolated experiment but a repeated pattern. Assaults come in short bursts rather than one continuous push, often involving small groups rather than massed formations. Each wave is designed to test a different route, probe Ukrainian reactions, and search for gaps in coverage. The rhythm is fast, with little pause between attempts, because commanders appear to believe that pressure itself can create opportunity. This creates a sense of constant motion on the battlefield, even when no major breakthrough occurs. A motorcycle team or a foot patrol lacks the protection and redundancy that larger formations once provided. When one element is stopped, there is often no nearby support that can quickly absorb the shock or change the situation. The use of tanks as rear support also carries risks that are not always obvious during planning. When infantry slows down or runs into resistance, armored vehicles are forced to move forward to stabilize the situation. That movement often happens under time pressure, which limits careful route selection. Once tanks begin to advance, their size and sound make concealment harder, and their role shifts from protection to liability for the units ahead. This creates moments where the entire assault depends on whether armor can move without being fixed in place. What unfolds near Pokrovsk suggests not a single failed push, but a chain of moves that keeps tightening the space for error. A delayed vehicle, a unit that hesitates, or a route that suddenly feels exposed can shift the balance in seconds. At that point, the danger no longer comes from the trench ahead, but from the sky above, where movement begins to draw attention. And once that attention locks on, the next phase of the fight starts long before any soldier reaches the line. Ukrainian control of the approach routes around Pokrovsk is built on near-constant FPV surveillance that turns wide terrain into a narrow funnel of risk. Drones remain in the air across forests, fields, and secondary paths, creating a layered picture of movement rather than waiting for contact at the trench line. This coverage does not rely on one platform or one altitude, because different drones rotate to keep eyes on the same spaces as daylight and weather shift. The result is a living map where changes stand out quickly, even when units try to move slowly or blend into the background. When Russian groups begin to move or gather, detection often happens at the first stage of the approach rather than at the last. A small cluster forming near a tree line, a vehicle stopping longer than planned, or a track appearing where none existed before can trigger attention from above. Once that attention starts, drones do not rush to strike, because their main task is to hold contact and confirm direction, speed, and intent. Units that believe they are unseen often keep moving along planned routes, unaware that their path is already marked. By the time they sense danger, options have already narrowed, and turning back can be as risky as moving forward. Forests and open ground around Pokrovsk once offered cover through distance and clutter, but UAV control has stripped that protection away. Tree lines now act as key points that help drones measure movement rather than hide it. Open fields create clear contrast between static ground and anything that moves across it, which makes slow progress easier to track over time. What appears safe at ground level can look fully exposed from above, especially when movement follows routes that repeat across days. This constant watch quickly turns into action, because once Russian units slow down or pause, drones do not just observe but move into strike. FPV attacks begin as soon as groups hesitate near tree lines or field edges. After the first hit, movement becomes cautious and broken, with small groups stopping to listen, scan, or wait for orders that arrive too late. Those pauses do not reduce danger, because drones use that time to line up follow-on attacks. The longer a group stays in one place, the easier it is for operators to confirm positions and pass targets forward. Control of approach routes does not stop at surveillance, because observation immediately feeds fire. Once a target is confirmed, drones stay close, adjusting angle and distance while FPV strikes or guided fire follow as units try to shift position. Soldiers advancing under this pressure shorten decisions and avoid bold moves, which weakens coordination as leaders focus on survival rather than shaping the push. As a result, the approach breaks apart before reaching the line. By the time Russian units near the outer edge of Ukrainian positions, they are already under attack from above, and the fight has started long before any trench is reached. Ukrainian forces around Pokrovsk use FPV drones as an active weapon that meets Russian units while they are still moving toward the line. These drones are launched as soon as infantry groups, motorcycles, quad bikes, or light vehicles are confirmed on approach routes. FPV teams focus on speed and timing, striking columns while they are spread out and vulnerable rather than waiting for them to close up. The drones often hit the lead element first, which forces the rest of the group to slow down or scatter. When a motorcycle team or truck is disabled, nearby soldiers must decide whether to help, hide, or keep moving. In several engagements, the loss of one vehicle is enough to halt an entire push, because the rest of the unit no longer knows which route is safe. Beyond direct strikes, UAVs play a second and more important role by guiding indirect fire. Once a target is identified, the drone stays overhead and sends live position updates to mortar teams and artillery units. This allows Ukrainian fire crews to engage targets they cannot see from the ground. Rounds are adjusted in real time, based on drone feedback, until impacts land close enough to force movement or cause losses. This method is especially effective when Russian units try to hide after an FPV strike. Infantry often moves into tree lines, shell holes, or small terrain features, hoping to wait out the danger. From above, the drone continues to track these positions and marks them for follow-up fire. Mortar rounds then land around the area, pushing soldiers out of cover or pinning them in place. Every extra minute allows drone operators to refine coordinates and improve accuracy. As impacts get closer, units are forced to move again, often into open ground where FPV drones can return. This layered approach creates pressure from more than one direction at the same time. FPV drones threaten from above and close range, while mortars and artillery arrive from a distance. Russian units cannot focus on a single threat, because reacting to one exposes them to another. A group that spreads out to avoid artillery becomes easier to isolate with FPV strikes, while a group that stays tight risks heavier losses from indirect fire. The effect on timing is critical. Assaults that rely on speed lose momentum once indirect fire begins. Units slow down, routes change, and coordination with supporting armor weakens. Communication also suffers under this pressure. Radio traffic increases as units report losses and request guidance, which delays decisions. Drone operators continue to relay updates, keeping Ukrainian fire teams informed while Russian commanders struggle to regain control. This imbalance allows Ukraine to decide when and where the next strike happens. By the time Russian units reach the outer edge of Ukrainian positions, many have already taken losses or burned time trying to escape guided fire. Some groups turn back, while others arrive fragmented and disorganized. At that stage, the assault no longer has a clear shape or purpose. What remains is a set of small elements reacting to threats rather than advancing toward an objective. As these attacks stall under combined FPV strikes and guided fire, another problem begins to surface. The moment infantry slows down and calls for help, heavier vehicles are pushed forward to stabilize the situation. That decision brings tanks and armored vehicles into the same airspace that drones already control, setting the stage for the next phase of the fight. Russian tanks entered the fighting around Pokrovsk after several infantry pushes slowed or stalled on the approach. As small units reported losses and delays, armored vehicles were ordered forward to cover withdrawal routes and reopen movement corridors. The tanks moved behind scattered infantry elements, advancing along the same forest edges and open lanes that drones had already been watching. From the air, the change was clear, because heavier vehicles left stronger visual and thermal traces as soon as they started moving. As the tanks rolled forward, their pace dropped to match the infantry ahead of them. They slowed near tree lines, paused at crossings, and adjusted position to cover soldiers regrouping after FPV strikes. These short stops were visible from above, and UAVs stayed fixed on the area while relaying updates. Within minutes, Ukrainian operators knew where the armor was, how fast it was moving, and which routes it was using. FPV drones began to approach from behind and from the flanks, aiming at the weaker angles rather than the front. Instantly, drones struck close enough to force tanks to halt or change direction. Crews responded by backing away, turning hulls, or stopping to reassess, which left infantry without moving cover. Once that happened, soldiers who had been following the tanks broke formation and scattered toward nearby cover. Some tanks attempted to push forward again, firing toward suspected Ukrainian positions to keep pressure on the line. Each renewed movement drew more attention from UAVs, which stayed overhead and corrected positions for indirect fire teams. Mortar rounds began landing near the armored vehicles, forcing them to shift position once more. This repeated movement and stopping cycle made progress uneven and slow. When one tank was forced to withdraw early, infantry units in front of it lost their main source of protection. Soldiers who had been advancing behind armor now faced open ground without cover. Movement paused as leaders tried to reorganize groups that had split apart during the engagement. That pause exposed the area to further strikes, and FPV drones returned to target vehicles and soldiers still moving. As losses mounted, additional tanks were committed to stabilize the situation. These vehicles followed the same routes as the first group, which were already known and tracked. UAVs did not need to search because movement patterns repeated across the same terrain. Each new armored entry triggered the same sequence of observation, strike attempts, and forced repositioning. The presence of tanks also increased activity behind the assault line. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and recovery vehicles moved forward to support damaged or stalled armor. That rear area traffic created new targets for drones watching supply routes. Several support vehicles were hit or forced to turn back before reaching the tanks. As the engagement continued, infantry units became increasingly fragmented. Some groups withdrew after losing contact with armor, while others stayed pinned near cover waiting for orders. Communication slowed as radio traffic increased and messages overlapped. Coordination between infantry and armor broke down, leaving each element reacting on its own. By the time tanks pulled back, the assault no longer had a clear direction. The original objective was not reached, and the force had taken losses without gaining ground. This sequence repeated across multiple attempts near Pokrovsk. Each time tanks were brought in to support infantry, they entered an area already controlled from the air. Instead of restoring momentum, their arrival marked the point where the push began to unravel. Once armor withdrew, the assault ended not with a decisive clash, but with stalled movement and exposed routes leading back from the front. Russian operations near Pokrovsk began to slow, once repeated assaults failed to gain ground, and attention shifted toward keeping units supplied and ready for another attempt. Commanders pushed fuel, ammunition, and fresh personnel forward using light vehicles that could move quickly along secondary roads and field tracks. Supply movement started in short runs rather than long convoys. Vehicles moved in small numbers, paused near tree lines, and then continued forward when the route looked clear. This method was meant to reduce losses during transport and keep pressure on the front by restoring combat power as fast as possible. However, the same paths were often used more than once, and patterns began to form. Ukrainian UAVs adjusted their focus once fighting at the front slowed. Instead of staying only over assault lanes, drones followed movement behind the line where vehicles gathered and turned off established roads. Repeated trips along the same tracks made these routes easier to spot and track over time. Once identified, UAVs stayed with the traffic and reported movement without immediate strikes. Several supply vehicles were intercepted before reaching forward units. Some were hit while moving, while others turned back after realizing they were being followed. In a few cases, drivers stopped and waited, hoping the drone would leave, which only increased the time spent exposed. These interruptions prevented supplies from arriving together and broke the flow that units depended on. At the front, the effects appeared quickly. Infantry groups that had pulled back after earlier fighting waited longer for ammunition and medical support. Wounded soldiers remained in place until evacuation could be arranged, and damaged vehicles stayed where they were. Without steady resupply, units hesitated to move forward again. Attempts to restart attacks became uneven. Fresh troops arrived in small numbers and at different times, which made coordination difficult. Some groups advanced briefly, then stopped when support did not arrive as expected. Others stayed in cover and waited for orders that were delayed by disrupted communication and movement. As supply pressure increased, command decisions became more cautious. Larger movements were avoided, and units were split into even smaller elements. This reduced losses during transport but weakened the strength of each push. What reached the front was often enough to hold ground, but not enough to regain momentum. The overall tempo changed. Earlier in the fighting, attacks came close together and kept Ukrainian defenders under constant strain. After supply routes were disrupted, pauses between attempts grew longer. These gaps allowed Ukrainian positions to reorganize and prepare without facing sustained pressure. Over several cycles, activity shifted away from advance and toward recovery. Priority moved to evacuating wounded soldiers, pulling back damaged equipment, and securing remaining vehicles. Support traffic moved more carefully and often stayed further from the front, which reduced detection but slowed response. This process did not end with a clear collapse or a single turning point. Routes that once carried supplies became quiet, and units that once prepared for attack focused on holding position. By controlling movement behind the line, Ukraine avoided the need for large battles at the front. The defense held because opposing forces could not maintain the flow needed to keep attacks going. Around Pokrovsk, advances stopped well before reaching the trenches, not because of one decisive clash, but because the fight could no longer be fed. What is unfolding around Pokrovsk makes one point hard to ignore, because modern warfare is no longer decided by who brings more soldiers or heavier tanks to the line. The battle has shown how control of information, control of the low sky, and control of timing now shape whether any force can even reach its objective. Russian infantry advances were detected early. FPV drones broke formations before contact, tanks were drawn in and exposed, and supply routes were disrupted before pressure could be sustained. The result was not a dramatic breakthrough or collapse, but a steady loss of momentum that stopped attacks far from the trenches. However, Russia still has options ahead. Tactics can change, counter-drone systems can be expanded, and formations can adapt to reduce exposure. Yet each adjustment brings higher costs, slower movement, and new risks in a battlefield where visibility is constant and reaction time is short. The larger question now goes beyond Pokrovsk itself. Can combined infantry and armor formations survive when every movement is watched from above? Or is this battlefield a preview of how future wars will be fought across many fronts? Is this a temporary stall shaped by local conditions, or the early signal of a deeper shift that armies around the world will have to face? Share your view in the comments. If this kind of clear battlefield analysis matters, like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to Military Force for more direct reporting on modern war and global security.